So the first thing I just want to give a big shout out to Local First for having these webinars and for doing all that they're doing for Arizona businesses right now during the pandemic. I mean, they have really come to the forefront, and they're just such a great partner and an asset for our state and our business. And so I just want you guys to know, Thomas and Kimber and Melissa and everybody else there, that we certainly appreciate all that you're doing for local businesses as well. So thank you very much for having me and for doing these webinars. So we'll jump right into the first slide, and I'm assuming everybody here is interested in kind of learning about how to approach your landlord. Either you're, trying to have this conversation with your landlord about potentially revising your terms, or find out what the possibilities are for rent relief. So the first thing you want to do is really take a look at your written lease as it is right now, become really familiar with the basic terms that are there, and that'll help kind of empower you for when you do go to talk to your landlord, that what your obligations are right now. So some of the basic terms that you should really be looking at are, obviously what is your rent obligation now? Are you paying base rent? Do you have a triple net lease where you're obligated to pay CAM charges or landlord's property taxes or insurance? And then are you obligated, is there a percentage rent provision in there where you're required to give the landlord a percentage of your sales or income from your business? So just taking a look at those provisions and getting an understanding of what you're obligated to now is helpful. Couple other things: the term of your lease. Do you have 6 months left? Do you have 5 years left? Do you have options to extend the term? Just understand when your obligations are going to terminate. Did you provide a security deposit when you initially signed your lease? And how much was that? Are you eligible to assign your lease to another tenant or sublet either all or a portion of your of the lease premises to somebody else? And then, what constitutes an event of default if you do stop paying rent, and what are landlord's remedies? So usually that's about 3/4 of the way through your lease, is somewhere around there. There should be a list of what constitutes default. And then finally, take a look at if the tenant is an entity, did you or any principal of the company personally guarantee the obligations of the loan, or not the loan, the lease? And then if there is a time limit on your guarantee, is the guarantee only good for the first 5 years of the lease, or is there a cap on the amount of the liability? Are you only responsible for, say, just rent and not any other obligations like indemnity obligations or anything like that? So, just kind of go through your lease initially and write down the basic terms are, so that you're familiar with those. So the next thing you should consider is starting to kind of hone in on specific terms in your lease that might help you during this time and might be in your favor. So here are some provisions that you want to take a look at and see if they are in your lease and what they say. The first one is force majeure, and I think that is the term du jour these days. Everybody seems to be mentioning this, but maybe not everybody understands what it means. And usually at the end of a lease, there is a provision in there that relieves the parties from some or all of the obligations for certain circumstances that are outside of their reasonable control, like acts of God, and riots, and natural disasters, those types of things. So take a look and see if your lease has that provision. It's usually towards the end of the lease. If you don't have that in there, a court is not going to read those terms into your lease. So either you have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, the court's not find that you have that protection. So if take a look at what it says in the list of actions that might be outside of your control, and some measure provisions do say that they do cover pandemics or epidemics, but if they don't, you might want to look at some other terms that might be in there, like acts of God, action of government, or some catch-all language, like and other events which are outside the reasonable control of the parties. There is some discussion, about whether a pandemic is considered an act of God. I don't think there's anything definitive right now, but I think it's enough to argue that a pandemic is an act of God. it could very well be covered under that term. One thing you also take a look at in your force majeure, if you do have one, is what types of obligations if an event like this does occur. A lot of times landlords put in their lease that you're excused from certain obligations like construction or tenant improvements, that type of stuff, but you're not excused from paying rent. They specifically carve out that obligation from this provision. So take a look at that and see whether rent payment is included or excluded. Some other provisions to look at, and you're going to see if you have these, are there any specific provisions that address abatement of rent? So a lot of times during the initial phase, a lease, when you're either doing tenant improvements or a landlord is doing their work to get the premise ready, there's a period where you don't have rent. Sometimes there's provisions that if landlord has to do repairs or maintenance, they will abate your rent during that period. And then generally, if there is a casualty or a condemnation, there's usually a provision in there that a portion of your rent is abated while the casualty occurs and while the premises is being repaired, or it's reduced based on how much of your premises that you can use after the casualty or the condemnation. So those are a couple things that, you at this point, it's, know that they're there. I'm not necessarily confident that they can be used as an argument against the landlord for abatement of rent, but it kind of depends. I mean, take a look at what's defined as a casualty, because it might not just be a fire or something like that. It may be the definition of a casualty might be broader, and you might be able to include what's going on with the pandemic right now in that. Another provision is, if you're not allowed to use utilities or other services in the premises, sometimes a landlord will allow you to abate rent until those services are provided again. A couple other terms to look for. Access. Sometimes a lease will have specific language in there that guarantees tenant access to the premises. And then most leases also have a quiet enjoyment provision that says so long as you're not in default of your lease, you're eligible to quiet enjoyment of the premises during the term of the lease. These are kind of arguments that are being batted around at this point about whether those constitute, whether the pandemic, if you can't actually operate your business, does that prevent you from having access to the premises? And does it obstruct your quiet enjoyment? These are arguments that are kind of going around amongst attorneys right now, and it's debatable whether they would work, but you should know whether they're in there at this point and see that they might be helpful later down the road. Another provision that it's not super prevalent, but if your business is in a shopping center or a retail type building, sometimes there's provisions in there that if the occupancy level goes below a certain percentage, or if an anchor tenant leaves the shopping center or something like that, you're eligible for a reduction in early termination of the lease. So take a look and see if that's also in there, and that might give you some assistance as well. So outside of the lease itself, I gave you guys a couple doctrines that might be helpful in arguing a reduction of rent. And the first one is impossibility or impracticability of performance, and the other one is frustration of purpose. Those are both doctrines that have been litigated in Arizona courts. They're pretty similar, but they do have some distinct differences. But I'm not going to go through all of the terms and what you need to prove, but there's more and more people arguing these, coming to fruition. So I think at some point they're going to be litigated in court based on the pandemic, and we'll see what the courts say. But generally, these provisions are narrowly construed. I don't think courts like to use them very often. But, I don't think anyone's dealt with a pandemic like this in a long, long time. So this might be the extreme case where courts say, yes, that these provisions should be recognized as a way to modify a lease. One thing I do want to bring to your attention on these two doctrines too is if you are arguing that you can't pay rent because of a frustration of purpose or impracticality, take a look at your lease and see if there is a provision in there that says that tenant assumes the risk that your specific permitted use is maybe prohibited due to governmental actions or changes in the law. So that might be a strike against you if for some reason you're doing some type of business and the law changes and says, nope, you can't do that anymore. Like for instance, the restaurant industry that says you can't be open now. If there's a provision in your lease that says, well, you assume that risk when you sign the lease, I think a landlord's gonna have a good argument against you for, why you shouldn't have any relief. So outside of the lease, though, a couple of other ways you can look for relief are to look at your tenant insurance and see what it covers. A lot of times your insurance will cover business interruption. And so have that conversation, if you haven't already, have that conversation with your insurance agent and see if you do have business interruption. And if you do have it, are there any exclusions? I know some of my clients have already tried this, but apparently pandemics were specifically excluded from their coverage. So, explore that and see if maybe you can get some relief through your insurance. Another thing to look at through insurance is take a look at the lease and look at what kinds of insurance your landlord is obligated to carry. Sometimes it will specifically say that the landlord carries 6 months or 1 year loss of rent insurance. And that might help you in your negotiation with landlord, because if you know that your landlord's insurer is going to cover some of this loss of rent that you're not paying, you might be able to bring that to their attention and say, listen, you're gonna have coverage for this, so maybe you could be a little bit more lenient in working with me on the rent relief. Another thing, and I'm sure everybody is doing this, and there's so many things going right now on a daily basis, but try to keep up to date with local, state, and federal governmental acts, which again seem to be changing on a daily basis. You know, right now, I know Local First did a webinar on relief a couple weeks ago with Karen Seckler. Take a look at whether you can, whether you're eligible for that relief, and see if you're eligible for grants or low interest loans. My opinion is you probably want to figure out whether you're eligible sooner or later and apply for those, because I think at some point, probably in the near future, relief funds are going to run out. You want to be you don't want to be caught holding the bag if you were eligible and then you can't get any relief through those. Take a look at prohibitions on evictions. Obviously, we just got a new executive order in Arizona on Monday, and we'll talk about that. But see if there's any other prohibitions as well. Take a look also if there's any tax relief or relaxed restrictions, either for your industry or across the board. Those might help as well. So as I just mentioned, Governor Ducey issued an executive order on Monday. The order is 2020-21. And it essentially halts evictions in Arizona for small businesses and nonprofits. The order prohibits landlords from evicting or locking out these companies unless a court determines that it is contrary to the interest of justice. So what that generally means is, you know, if for some reason you're operating in a legal business, or for some reason it's contrary to the law, your landlord could actually petition a court to evict you anyways, regardless of this executive order being in place. I don't imagine that's going to happen to too many people, but there is that caveat in there, so just be aware of it. The order is in effect until May 31st, 2020. And the only thing the order does is provides, you know, a stay from evictions or halts evictions for that period of time. It does not prevent, give you any relief from the obligation to pay your rent. So even if your landlord may not be able to evict you during this period, you still may technically be in default under the terms of your lease if you're not paying rent while the order's in effect.
Jennifer,
yeah,
you have one question.
Sure.
It asks, do the prohibitions on evictions mean that we would still have to pay fines?
That you would still have to pay fines?
Yeah.
To your landlord?
It does not specify. It just says, do the prohibitions on evictions mean that we would still have to pay fines?
Okay.
Yeah, late fees.
Yes, late fees. Okay. Yep. So this executive order does not give any type of relief at all. And so if the only thing you do is that your landlord can't keep up their period, but if you're not paying rent, you know, your regular rent, any late fees, any interest that might be charged per the terms of your lease, all of that stuff would still accrue during this time. So going back to the slides, who is covered? So the first hurdle is that you must be a tenant that is unable to pay their rent due to financial hardship caused by the pandemic. So I think everybody is probably in that boat, but if for some reason there's a tenant out there that can't pay their rent for some other reason, not associated with the pandemic, then this executive order would not apply. And then the types of businesses that are eligible for this relief are businesses that are covered under the federal Paycheck Protection Program, which is generally businesses with fewer than 500 employees. And you can be just about any type of entity, like a sole proprietor, partnership, C Corp, S Corp, LLC, independent contractor, 501c3, self-employed businesses, and 501c19, which are veterans organizations. I looked that up this morning. So a couple other additional terms that are in the executive order. The tenant, in order to receive the financial assistance, let's see, that going to receive financial assistance through the public programs from the federal government, you must agree to apply a portion of those funds to your rent. It doesn't say anything more than that, except that landlords cannot require you to apply a specific amount or a percentage of your relief funds to the rent. So all you have to do is pay, if you're going to get those relief funds, you pay a portion to cover your rent, but there is no obligation to pay all of your rent with the funds, or 50% of the rent with your funds, anything like that. It's just, it's a little open-ended. So what does a portion mean? It means, I don't know, is it $50? Is it $500? It's kind of left in the air. So it's up to your discretion, as long as you're using a portion of those for your rent.
All right.
And just go ahead.
This one asks, ideas on convincing landlord to extend the lease. I was supposed to purchase by July, and unfortunately now that won't be possible.
Okay, well, we're going to get to talking to your landlord about your lease in a minute, but at this point, you probably want to have that discussion with them sooner rather than later. I don't know if it's already been broached with your landlord, but my feeling is that landlords are being inundated with requests from tenants to modify their lease or to do an amendment or some type of rent relief. So the sooner you get in and talk to your landlord about that, the better, because at some point my feeling is that they're just going to be exhausted with all of the requests, and the landlords that are being generous at this point are going to stop being generous at some point. So does that help answer your question?
Yes, but she's being very difficult and unwilling to renew the lease.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do outside of the terms of your lease. So did you say it expires in May? Was that it?
July.
Oh, in July. And do you have an option to extend, or is there no option?
She actually says I was supposed to purchase by July, and unfortunately now that won't be possible.
Purchase the premises or purchase a different place?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Jennifer, it's Jennifer. Would you want to take yourself off mute and you can ask the question maybe a little bit better?
Hi there.
Hi.
Yes, I was preparing to purchase the building, and now I am using the funds that I had saved to meet the rest of my bills. I own a preschool, and my preschool's been closed since March 13th.
Okay.
And my lease ends at the end of June when the purchase was supposed to take place. And
Okay.
I've been trying to negotiate with her to convince her to let me have at least another 6 months or another year.
Sure.
To complete the purchase, because my funds are being depleted by the day.
Yeah.
At this point of time. And I'm still current on my rent and still anticipating continuing to pay my rent with her. So I'm just seeking ideas on how to word things, or if I could have maybe a lawyer write something up, just any sort of ideas to support me to try to keep my business in place and be able to reopen and still continue to purchase.
Sure. Does your lease currently have an option to purchase in the lease?
It's not directly written in the lease, but we've just had a verbal agreement. I've been a tenant for 6 years, and she wants me to buy the building, but now I think everyone's just very heightened right now.
Yeah. Are there a lot of other tenants in the building?
No, it's a house that's been transformed into a preschool, so it's just my building.
Okay. I mean, we can talk about this later, but I think probably the issue is just getting to the root of what her concerns are about extending it. Is she worried about you know, the price, that may change because of the pandemic, or?
Yes, that some of the concerns that she's voiced are because I'm not currently open, so she's worried about my commitment to paying rent on a building that doesn't have a
Sure.
business in it. But it is a child care, so once we're on kind of the other end of this, I can reopen. And I've also told her too that I do have the option to reopen for essential workers if need be.
Mm-hmm.
So I've already
Okay.
discussed that with her, and then I don't know what her other ideas are. And she's always been difficult. Sorry, not to not be nice,
Happens.
but
Okay, you know, this is probably, I'm happy to talk to you either after the presentation or, you know, at a time that's convenient to you, and maybe we can strategize together about what's the best way
okay,
to approach her on an individual basis.
that would be lovely.
Okay,
Thank you.
great, thanks. So going back to the executive order, so we talked about not that a portion of your relief funds need to go to pay rent. Can't require you to pay a specific amount or percentage. The order does not prohibit the continuation of any eviction actions that began prior to March 11, 2020, which is, I believe, the date that Governor Ducey declared a state of emergency. So if for some reason you were already in eviction proceedings, or if you had a notice of default from your landlord prior to that date, that they were going to start the process or anything like that, this executive order is not going to protect you from an eviction. And then the last provision that I put down there at the bottom is just a direct link to the full executive order. It's not very long. It's like maybe 2 pages. Would be good for you guys to just read through it and be familiar with what is and what's not required. So negotiating with your landlord, which we just kind of touched on, and you know, I represent a lot of tenants and a lot of landlords, so I'm on both sides of the argument. And what I'm seeing so far is really landlords are running the gamut. Some of them really want to be proactive and help their tenants, and are proposing, you know, changes to their lease. Some landlords are, you know, being in their heels, and if you are not paying your rent, or if you are telling your landlord you don't think you could pay your rent in the future, they are sending out notices of default or notices of anticipatory breach. So, you know, unfortunately, it kind of depends on who your landlord is and what kind of relationship you have, and really what their obligations are also. So just a couple, you know, tips is that, like I said before, if you feel like you need to ask for some relief or some type of change to your existing lease terms, be proactive and reach out to the landlord as soon as you possibly can, because, like I said, you know, attorneys right now are just seeing tons and tons and tons of landlords and tenants, you know, having issues, and at some point, landlords are just not going to be able to be as graceful as some of them are being now. So you really want to try and be at the front of the line on your request and not be the last tenant standing with no changes or no accommodations, because you might not be so lucky. And then to remember also, so, you know, obviously tenants are really hurting, businesses are closing, there's a lot of financial stress, but landlords are also feeling that financial stress from another angle, especially if they have a loan on their building that they own. You know, some loans are tied to rental, to the rents. And so if tenants are not paying rents, they might be in default of their loan. They might not be able to otherwise make their loan payments because of the pandemic. So you have to understand from their angle also that there's a lot of uncertainty and stress going on their side too. So while some may want to help accommodate their needs financially, it may not be possible for them. And then finally, you make sure before you go and talk to your landlord, understand what your financial situation is. To really take a look at your position and be realistic about what you're going to ask from your landlord, and whether, if that's granted, you're going to be able to fulfill those obligations and continue with the lease. You don't want to ask them for something, two months of rent relief, knowing that come month 3, you're not going to be able to make the rent, because it's kind of kicking the can down the road, and will likely just cause more stress in your life. So really take a look at your financial situation and determine what you need to ask for in the best case scenario and in the worst case scenario. I mean, if everything gets lifted in a month or 2 and you get to go back to work and open up your business and everything's great. I think that's probably the best case scenario at this point. But what happens if we're all hung down for 6 months, 8 months, or a recession goes for longer than a year, and your business doesn't make it? So you need to take a look at those things. One of the things that I was just talking to one of my tenant clients yesterday, and what we decided to do is that they have a very uncertain situation because they're in the middle of constructing the lease premises and turning it into a restaurant. Obviously, nobody is loaning money for a restaurant right now, so they lost their loan. And what we're negotiating with the landlord right now is that we're going to ask them for an extension of when their rent has to be due. So give them several months of free rent to hopefully pass the summer. But if for some reason they still can't get a loan for their restaurant, or the pandemic is still causing a lot of issues for them, that they would be able to buy themselves out of the lease for a certain amount, and then they don't have to worry about it. And for them, it was kind of a stress reliever, because if they have both of those terms in their amendments, then they know at the very least, if for some reason this doesn't come through, that at the end of the day they're going to be able to get out of the lease, and the landlord's not going to come after them for 10 years of rent. So you kind of have to start being creative with stuff like that. So my next slide is really about what can you ask your landlord for, and some possible relief that you should consider. The first one is deferred rent, which is really just putting off your current rent payments until a later date, which could be months. It could be 6 months if your landlord is willing. But essentially all it does is kind of put off the payments that are due now. So at some point at a later time, you're going to have to make up those payments. You might be able to ask, well, can we pay off those deferred payments over a certain amount of time? Can we add X amount to future rental payments to kind of make up for the lost rent? Or do we have to pay in one lump sum all of the rent that we've deferred? So you can kind of get creative with the repayments and all of that. The second one is rent abatement. So, and I think that obviously that's ideal to a lot of tenants, is that your landlord is just willing to waive the obligation to pay the rent for a certain amount of time. And I have seen landlords doing that. They're willing to give 2 months or 3 months of abatement while all of this plays out. And obviously that's a huge relief to tenants if they don't have to worry about it for the next couple months. But so it's a great thing to ask for, and if your landlord's willing to do it, wonderful. Another option is to ask your landlord for a rent reduction. And that would just be reducing the amount of your rent to a certain, lower amount. So if you're paying, $5,000 a month, can you pay $2,000 a month or $3,000 a month for 2 months or 3 months or something like that? And again, going back to reviewing your lease terms, are you just paying base rent? Are you paying triple net? Are you doing percentage? And then if you're going to ask for a reduction, can you ask for a reduction across the board, all of those? Or is the landlord just willing to provide a reduction on rent or the base rent or CAM charges or, something like that? And then a couple other options, obviously if your lease has a subletting or assignment provision, I mean, it's a little far-fetched because I'm not, there's not too many people out looking to rent now, but if you have somebody that's willing to take over your lease or bring on a subtenant where they are paying rent, and that can help alleviate your obligations, you might want to look at that avenue. And then your security deposits, if you did put in a security deposit at the beginning of the lease, how much is the security deposit, and maybe ask your landlord if the landlord can use that for rent temporarily until you guys are back on your feet, and then replenish the deposit at a later time. It's if anything else, at least that might help a little bit. And then finally, you might just want to ask the landlord for a loan. Is he willing to convert any unpaid rent into a loan that you pay with interest down the road or over a certain amount of time? That might help alleviate some stress as well. And I think that's all I have. Yep. So I am happy to talk to answer questions and anything else.
We did have one come through just a little bit ago. She says, our lease technically ended in February, but they have not contacted or replied to me regarding renewal, but have continued to cash rent checks. Since I am not technically under lease anymore, am I without protection regarding the no eviction order?
Well, you do technically have a lease, but and it first of all, it depends on what your lease says. So usually at the end of a lease, it has a holdover provision that says if you stay past the term of your lease, it turns into a month-to-month lease. And then either you have to pay you have to continue to pay the rent, or you pay the rent plus a certain amount. But even without that provision, by law, it just turns into a month-to-month lease. And unfortunately, that the executive order is not going to protect you, because your lease is for 30 days, and so when the 30 days are up, that's the end of your lease. So if you are there from April 1st to April 30th, and May 1st comes around, technically your lease is terminated. And so there's no obligation for the landlord to not kick you out if they don't want to. And again, I'm happy to, if you want to reach out to me directly later, we can take a look at what terms are in your lease and figure out if there's a good strategy to get your landlord's attention and see if we can get something in writing to help protect you guys during this time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's see, there is one more that just came up. It said, worst case, have to close the business. No personal guarantee, and the LLC owns no assets. Lease is between the LLC and owner.
Okay. Then you're in probably a good position, because if the landlord can't come after your personal assets and the LLC assets don't have a lot or anything, the landlord doesn't have a whole lot of options.
Jennifer, can you go ahead and throw up that first slide again? Someone's asking how they can reach you again, and I know your phone number and email.
Oh, sure.
Is on that first slide. So if there's any more questions, at least that'll be up and people can take your info.
Yeah, my email and direct line are there. That's my office line, but it now goes to my cell phone, and I am working from home in my closet, as you can see. But you should be able to reach me by either.
All right, so unless there are any other questions, we'll go ahead and end this webinar. And thank you so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate all the time you took to put this together and the recommendations.
Absolutely, and thank you guys for participating. Hopefully it was helpful, and if any questions do pop up later, please feel